koutou, and I have to echo Chair's comments about
Oh, I'm very sorry, there was one last thing. For the microphones, we're doing this in manual, so if you want to talk into them, just give them a push. And you would have seen those questions that we had, yes.
the aquifer. But of course, one of the points we were going to make today, and Gray will make to my left, who's a planner, of course, is around the wider framework for the plan change that was signed at 19 million versus 7 million issue. And we do have, of course, our tractor changes version, which is a comprehensive response to that issue. So we just wanted to lead, and I won't be speaking too long, but if we could just bring up, and hopefully it's been handed around, just a handout.
Yep.
And what I did, and it was fairly short effort, was, oh, it's going to go on the screen.
So just for those who might be watching in on us, we've just been handed around a 6-pager, I think it is. 5 to 6 pages. Titled Model Uncertainty versus Certainty of Council. Regarding
Yeah, thank you. And it's basically, most of it just quotes out of reports provided by council. And it was an attempt to sort of just draw attention to the issue of uncertainty involvement, because as the panels are there, basically councils put all the eggs in one basket around this model being right. And if we continue abstractions at current levels, 2012 levels, 20 million for the aquifer, that is going to be safe in terms of continuing and essentially surface water and water quality limits. And Shane Smith, who's here with us, who's got obviously more interesting area in the area, and will comment. We just wanted to pick up, well, how certain is the model, and to what extent can you rely upon it vis-a-vis what's expected of you in the NTSFM? And so all I've done is pick through, and I acknowledge it immediately on the first page, that you must read all reports in context and in full for context. So this can only be
Can I just
extractions.
Sorry, I just need to sort this mic out. This one's out. This one.
Extractions only, context required. But as we read through, just the limitations given by Mr. Rakowski in his report, acknowledges the level of residual uncertainty, limitations in model calibration. These are uncertainties in the model. and that's reflected also and responsibly reported in his 2018 August report around uncertainty analysis. So the proposition under heading key findings, there are signs the aquifer is reaching a new equilibrium and further reductions in flow will not continue. Now, to what extent is that certain? Because the reference to signs, quote unquote, we're asking you to pay careful consideration to whether that is sufficiently certain for the purposes of your assessment. We say it's not. That again, page 14, an acknowledgement of uncertainty and the cross-reference to the Monte Carlo. So we've just given, again, those quotes. You'll be familiar with them, so I won't go through them all in too much detail. But, it is a case of eggs in one basket, because para 1.10 of Mr. Rakowski's rebuttal, which is there on the screen, the model forms the basis of many tank policies, including, importantly, of course, the development of the allocation limits. And it's clear that it is a very complex system, as he recorded at 4.11, 4.12 of his evidence. And finally, we've given you that quote from his supplementary June evidence around uncertainty. So just having reminded you of those issues, and I'll ask Shay to speak to those, we've also contrasted that with what is the level of certainty of information expected.
That was going to be my question to ponder while you were talking, yes?
Yes. And so, of course, we've cross-referenced the para 1.6 best information available. And importantly, your sources of information for certainty are not limited to the model, of course, and must include Mātauranga Māori and other sources of information, some of which you've had in terms of the evidence from Ngāti Kahungunu. If the information is uncertain, must interpret in a way that will best give effect. So really our position around that abstraction limit is, given residual and remaining uncertainty in the model, and the risk also of, there are some residual uncertainties where the model may or may not be correct, it is appropriate to opt for a lower abstraction limit, and that is the evidence you've already had from Ngāti Kahungunu, and that will better give effect to the NPSFM. And closing point around this theme was, as you know, there is no uncertainty around the priorities. It's the health and well-being of water bodies is number one. That does precede the economic and other considerations that are important, but they do sit lower in the hierarchy. So we just wanted to sort of remind you of that position. And on that note, I'll hand over to Niall. Do you want to go next, or Shay? Niall, thank you.
Perhaps you've already gone to the question that I was going to ask, but the second question was, and I made a presumption that the 70 million cubic metres is the allocation, is the method that you're thinking that would be most appropriate in those circumstances where there's uncertainty. Would you also consider there might be other measures that might be also equally or as correspondingly appropriate and important as well? Just something to ponder while you're presenting.
It's an important question, so I'll hand it over to Niall to speak further.
Sure.
Is that?
Your submissions from July. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Oh, thank you.
That's the one that reads as
Oh,
a
yes,
16 metre.
Oh, so the issue captured by that paragraph relates to, do we apply an overall broad judgment as, do the commissioners apply an overall broad judgment, or can they rely upon the expressions of priorities set out in the national policy statement? It's exactly the same issue, of course, based in the King Salmon litigation. My submission is that you must go down to the NPS statement because it's not preferred, it's not, notified state or what have you. So it's a King Salmon proposition, basically. And so we shouldn't rely on Section 5 to override that hierarchy which is on the screen. That's the short point. Well, yeah, indeed, part two, because as per King Salmon, that we've chunked it down to the next level, which is we've got our operative NPS, a statement of national priorities set by the Crown, obviously, and that is what we implement, give effect. And I'm grateful for the question, and I suppose that is the point made subsequently in paragraph 14 of that submission also. So,
I just thought I'd just add just a little comment, just a logistical one, because we've got our masks on some of the time and not other times. We might, if someone can't hear someone, just say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you were saying, and it's going to be the same for us panelists. We might not, because we might read lips more than we actually hear the words, and we don't have that advantage anymore. So don't feel offended if we, hey, can you just repeat that again? And similarly for yourselves, if you can't hear what we're saying, please ask us to repeat the question.
All right, well, no other questions at this stage. We will bear in mind the important question asked to us, which was, is it possible to rely on a combination of a lower abstraction limit, which we have put in our evidence at 70 million, plus other methods, and if so, what are those other methods? So I'll get my team to respond to that as they go through.
Kia ora. I'll just touch on it. I think Shane and Greg could probably cover it, but there's other mechanisms. We don't see the total allocation as being the be-all and end-all, and there's potentially only as good as, in our view, the phase-out or the corresponding policy to phase out and remove over-abstraction, but importantly to avoid it in future, an emphasis on avoid rather than the suite of mitigation measures which we view are now contrary to policy 11 within the NPS. But there's other monitoring mechanisms. They're all indicators, the groundwater levels, and looking at the adverse effects more in depth. Perhaps just to recap, thank you for meeting face to face, and the line of questioning and the memos that has been produced by the hearing panel. It's very much a line of questioning that we've had perhaps for the last 3 or 4 years, and amongst TANC, being a part of TANC, and we viewed them as very fundamental to the whole management of our waterways here in Heretaunga, and a lot of the issues that have been raised by tangata whenua, and that we've been privy to ourselves and Heretaunga Tai Whenua and those who have been participated and engaged through the TANC process. In this line of questioning, this is why we had to, why I felt the need to engage expertise in legal and planner. So this started a long time before the hearings, engaging and getting advice, and as Rob touched on, our alternate or emphasis on policies that we put in with the track changes to help, because we've been asking the same questions as well and haven't got clarity. So we have engaged legal law scientists for big emphasis or driver being this actual decision-making process even before the hearings. So thank you for, I guess, same as us trying to clarify or demystify what is the status and what are we actually managing. In our view, the 90 was plucked out of thin air and not based on science, but it was based on the highest use ever and a 95% confidence of supply. I think it's overstated that this is what the tank group want, and definitely for Tangata Whenua, it was conditional on sustainable management. And that's within our documents and our feedback written in as part of our submissions, the Mātakitaki paper, which aligns with the NPS Put Water First in the Te Manawatu hierarchy. And also, we've seen issues not just in the 2012 or 2013, issues of adverse effects from over abstraction occurred in years outside that worst case scenario, throughout the duration of years, and post the hearings that Waterway in Bridge Pa had 12 months of no flow. And that's observation from the local community. We asked for a water flow meter that gave a better, more fuller picture of the realities outside our communities there, and currently it's down the road at Turamoi, and it gives no, it doesn't tell us what's happening in other parts of the waterway. So we've asked for a flow gauge, and Shade will elaborate, and Ngāti Kahungunu has invested in flow gauges. So there's a number of other variables that we think have been left out in the modelling, and some of them have happened as of recently, with increase of tile drains, and in one instance the tile drains will discharge more water than the nearby spring, and we're concerned about the effects on the nearby spring. So we've commissioned some flow gauging of that nearby spring, because we think it's important and should be part of knowing and understanding the effects. And we're also looking at flow gauging at Mangaro or Wash Pool Station where they used to exist, versus just leaving it to the further down the river to the Moy, because as has been mentioned in the NPS, the better information into 1.6, we're going to gather it. We've asked it to be gathered. If we need to know, then we're going to do it, and we've started doing that already to better understand failing if the tank catchment plan doesn't capture it or not. We'll look to provide that information. Our fear is we're looking at this model maybe too simplistically and not fully taking into account the adverse effects as raised by Tangata Whenua due to over-allocation. To some extent, I'm wondering if they're not either believe that there are these adverse effects that are akin to, that arise from over-abstraction, over-allocation, or on either that they're not viewed as important, that these effects on Tangata Whenua, or at least where these effects, adverse effects to the values of Tangata Whenua exist in isolation. I mean, if they adverse effects felt by others, in some instances they are considered, but where they just fully fall on, for example, the Mahinga Kai values of Tangata Whenua that have occurred outside the 2012, if we put a total limit on that, then it's saying clearly that obviously adverse effects outside that date experienced environmentally, ecologically and culturally not as important or not considered. And we'll remind, we've been in this case into the Environment Court before, where we had a difference of opinion of council on maintain and enhance water quality, and a lot of focus on maintaining water quality. And we think this is similar in maintaining the water quantity in the corresponding equivalent section of the RMA, where we feel we're actually in a space of to need to restore the water quality, and what's been proposed is this new equilibrium at a new time where we don't agree with the starting point necessarily, and how is that chosen? It's from our understanding, it's to provide 95% confidence of supply of the new starting point in those the graphs that were provided in the council's response. And in tandem with that, setting a new limit, like I said, we need a robust policy to phase out, and we feel the actual and reasonable do not provide that. It may, as mentioned in the response, may provide a sinking lid, but we feel that's not strong enough, and that's secondary to providing 95% confidence supply, where the MPS is unequivocal in phasing out and not mitigating, but phasing out over-allocation. And we exist in a space of over-allocation, and a lot of the rhetoric is about forward planning and that will avoid over-allocation. But our current status is our view that we're in problems right now. And we'd like to have consider that the observations, particularly where there's not monitoring on the Paritua, and this is just one indicator of the effects, not to overstate it, but it's one of the worst. And even if the proposals will do some stream flow augmentation, which is mitigation, again, not avoid, if it was to do that, you're just isolating it to one indicator, and similar to the artificial gauge or putting water back in the stream to, in my mind, trick the flow gauge. You're just looking at indicators and not the whole picture, and that is the major cultural difference in terms of monitoring. We might look at all these pieces of numbers and quantify it, and less importance on qualifying it, but it's the whole picture and the whole planes in a maybe this is cliche, but in a holistic view of what's happening. And we're just trying to pick up some of these indicators this stream, this spring, because that's how it's usually considered, but not lose sight of the total effects of our groundwater dropping. So that's why the call from ourselves has been for groundwater level monitoring, and I might add that's been called for from the DHB as well.
I just wondered whether that was probably an opportunity to maybe ask some questions about, because I think it would be fair to say that there's an expectation there's always going to be some uncertainty with the science, and what we're talking about is the level of uncertainty does that give comfort or discomfort? And I'm particularly interested in your views that you're putting forward, that there's uncertainty around the science that supports the 90 million. I'm going to put it on the shoe on the other foot and say there's some uncertainty around the 70 million, like whichever number it is. And I just wondered whether you had any views around the uncertainty of 70. And I'll give you a specific example for us. And it was in your original evidence we heard during week 1, Mr. Chuka, where you had the 70 million, and then you had in brackets how you'd come to that, and it was about 78 point.
Based on the inputs and outputs tables,
yes,
right?
The inputs and the pumping and the recharge, and we asked you where did the 70 came from, and we got, I think, as Wilson said, it was a best guess in terms of being taking into account some principles, looking at previous abstractions from the aquifer in previous years, and so that was your best guess. So I'm just putting that back to you and saying if there's so much uncertainty about the 90 million, then there would be the same expectation or the same uncertainty with the 70. So
I'm almost finished. I'll wrap this up and try and touch on that, but I'll leave that predominantly to Shade. Part of those uncertainties, the last part of it, which I've mentioned, is the tile drains and how it's more dewatering of the landscape. Obviously, the adverse effects on Māori, and also what was the other one? The land use changes. So I can't reconcile how confident we are that there's not going to be further abstraction when there's significant land use changes. So this is within actual land use, and I think you might have recalled Mr. Apple's submission on our changing of a variety of apple. A specific variety requires more water, and that's probably not captured in terms of the spatial planning.
I think it was quite clear from a number of those submissions, particularly during week 2 and week 3, that there's an expectation or a desire and an expectation that more water will be made available.
Exactly, and so that's going to be more than what's used now. And from observation, if you go around the Hiratonga, there's been a whole lot of new orchards planted, and they're more densely planted, and obviously more water is required, and that creates all those uncertainties. And our 70 million with those ins and outs was an accounting measure. I think we incorporate those uncertainties and have a precautionary approach based on the adverse effects that we're experiencing, not just at the highest take, but the lowest take. And I'll pass it on to Shade Smith.
Thank you. Oh, a question.
Before we do, just a couple of questions. In your paragraph 6, you say, in many respects, the original version of the 62 supported and was not consistent with aspects of our evidence. Version versus the
Essentially, it looked at the ins and outs of an accounting matrix in the original and emphasised in a logical, sustainable management that you wouldn't take out more than what's going in. And I guess that's the major part that was not inconsistent with aspects of our evidence and submission. And that's in understanding how we limit and what's a sustainable amount to extract. But we felt, despite that, in the further policy seemed that it did not match up with the that statement that we should look at the ins and outs and the accounting matrix in the submission. The policy basically said it's about on reliability of supply economics first. So it said, in our view, or my view, it should be managed like this, but we're going to do this. And then it was changed. That part was in the front was taken out.
Original evidence, he's quite critical of that in versus out concept.
The one.
Just some comments from.
We had Shade logically coming next after the answering Dr. Carr's questions and Ms. Wilson, and I might have one or two very final comments.
That's great, and then I just want to make
And
sure
then-
that we cover off the questions.
Thank you.
Of
Yes.
course. That's great, thank you. Sorry, it's probably my fault for butting in the first place, but
We encourage that. So.
If I look at Mr. Smith's original evidence, he's critical of that in versus out concept and says it doesn't, I think, quite correctly include a whole lot of other dimensions about recharge and where the recharge comes from and where the water's taken from and all sorts of things like that. I still don't understand why taking that out of the technical report means that it supported your essential proposition that the sustainable limit on the aquifer should be 70 million cubic metres a year.
Do you mean leaving it in, or would support us?
Sorry.
Can I just assist with that? Because the language in para 6 was quite careful, simply to say, supported not inconsistent. And of course, you're right that that report doesn't get you to the 70 million. But I think it's the wider proposition Mr. Tuku was speaking to that, and of course we had to demonstrate to you that our briefs were relevant, therefore they had to cross-reference the Appendix 11 report in its original untracked formatting. So that's probably the context to para 6. I think a more technical answer would push that over to Mr. Smith, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Can I just throw one small issue in here, more by way of just getting you to think about it as you go through? It's not a direct question at this stage, but it relates to the point that Ngaio's made a couple of times this morning, that is the whole picture. I keep referring to, you don't have the whole picture. I'd quite like to have a discussion around that, not necessarily right now, because it really points to one of the underlying tensions, I think, in the whole resource consent process, and that is sort of tikanga versus science issue, which I suspect that's what part of the answer is. And the difficulty most of us have is counterbalancing the two. I mean, the RMA process is based on science, right? So it's a science kind of led. Yeah, I know. I mean, I would argue it is, but I know other people don't.
In my
I'm
view.
a bit worried with the line question because it might start the debate of the panel.
No, I
actually.
just want to throw that on the table as Ngaio and Shade are working their way through this, and maybe even to get them to expand a bit more on what they mean by that. I won't interject on what you're on at the moment, but just think about that as we go through, because I want to come back to it and maybe even
I'll speak to that a little
test the
bit.
thinking on that a bit more.
And perhaps to add to that is that certainly we see that there's an importance of the science, the groundwater science that's being used
Yeah.
here. There's equally important mātauranga Māori it's played, which may or may not have been included or given due recognition in terms of Ngāti Kaungunu's particular. And there's also the nexus where those mātauranga Māori and the science are very much aligned or very similar in the way that they're applied and used. So, yeah, interested to hear your comments on those.
Kia ora, and certainly agree with that point because it's not quite so binary. Obviously, Mātauranga Māori is scientific as well as based on tangible and intangible considerations. And Māori, as you know, is an observable characteristic in water quality. And so it is important to reflect that Schedule 26 is a critical component of the plan change, and then you've got the characteristics in there for Mātauranga Māori are to come later, mahinga kai, and that is just not good enough.
Yeah.
Those characteristics should be in there now, and that's something that probably does need an adjournment and further hearing, because you're not giving effect to the NPS if you're not including half the equation. Exactly your question, Commissioner.
I'll try and get this working. Again, I'll try and get this mic to Shade Smith sooner rather than later. But yeah, just on that holistic view of the science. So we don't see ourselves removed from any of those considerations, and it's been a need to look at policy, obviously science, and all as a collective picture, because that's where the decision making. I come from a science background. Obviously, Shade's a scientist, and through this process, I've had to learn a hell of a lot about planning and the law, and I'm fortunate to have the expertise on my left. But we do think that there is space for mātauranga or observations from locals where there hasn't been information gathered, and in lieu of that, to be appropriately considered and factored in, and it's hard to put these considerations in a model. It's not a common practice, and you know, we've shown a lot of goodwill to participate in the tank process and helping develop policy, bringing along scientists, and doing some own work off our own cost where council has not entertained it, to shed some light on the whole lot. I know that the Appendix 11 didn't fully support us, but there were some glimmers of understanding where we had a common, at least thinking about looking at the ins and outs and management on top of the adverse effects. But yeah, I'll pass it over to Shade Smith.
Kia ora tātou. I wonder if I might just start by really establishing a sort of picture in our mind about where it is that we've, you know, in terms of what a natural level or you know a desired state is of the aquifer, that we might look back in the past and go, okay, we were doing all right there, or you know, so that's why I brought these pictures here today. It's not the aquifer, but it's the recharge area. So you know, you've seen these pictures before, obviously. It's in 19, what was it? I think it's 50. The recharge area at the Ngariroro. This blue line is the current width of the managed river. And as you can see, there's, you know, 1950s, lots of area where the river's able to recharge. And so, you know, we think about natural character, we think about the habitat provision, all those ecosystem services that you know the river provides, and its connection to the aquifer. We think, well, that's pretty cool. And then we look at the current situation with the red overlaid is, you know, what that picture is there, and we can see it's quite constrained. And so I guess I just wanted to point that out really, because our sliding, you know, we suffer from the sliding baselines when we think about, well, in this case, aquifer level. And so the sort of conceptual setting for the modelling is based on, I think it goes back to, you know, just before sort of 2010, you know, in that sort of era, where we know from our own observations that the period 2006 to 2014, there was a huge development of abstraction and pump testing across the Heretaunga Plains, and that's when we really had these first incidences of bores going dry in the Bridge Pa area, you know, on the peripheries of the aquifer. And so, you know, I'm not suggesting we go back to the 50s to look at where we might need to establish what a level of the aquifer is that we can start to accept as being, you know, acceptable or desired state. I'm suggesting we go back, you know, only 10, 15 years to those levels where we're, you know, where we, you know, the communities in these areas along the margins of the aquifer were able to still utilise their own bores. And so really, I guess that's to keep that at the back of your mind as you consider the model and how it's constructed. And, you know, I appreciate the questions that the panel posed to the council. And, you know, and how can you justify, you know, allocating so much water when, you know, obviously water levels are being shown to be declining. Yes, there's obviously some knowledge gaps, and, you know, some of the research that we're was alluded to, we're partners in, as is the regional council. And I just want to point out that being partners in these research programs, that look at these areas where recharge is occurring, I have to say our partners are, they're frustrated by the regional council and their limitations on staff in the hydrology section and being able to look at things like this, and so essentially the argument, and as Rob has, Mr. Enright has pointed out, is that the model says this: it's sustainable level, it reaches a dynamic equilibrium at 90 per year. But does that really take account of the conceptual setting of the model, which, there's still questions about if we stopped increasing allocation and set abstraction at a limit, then we'll, the changes like that's occurred here, is that going to mean that we're going to regather that lost storage as a result of just maintaining abstraction? Well, these are questions that these research programs are going to answer, so will begin to answer in the next couple of years. So, so this, the models, I suppose, they're a simplification of the real thing, and no replacement for actual observations. They can be useful guides, but there's no such thing as a correct model, and since all model solutions are non-unique, and therefore, the use of ensembles of model solutions are used to try and capture that uncertainty. And two, the models are only as good as the conceptual understanding and available data for that system, which is kind of what I've been trying to explain today, is that, from the simplicity of the out versus in, it hasn't, I'm reliably told, shall we say, that it's not as simple as that. And we haven't considered things like storage and, the research, as I say, that we've been involved with, concepts such as the Braid Plain Aquifer and the ability for that Braid Plain Aquifer to be a buffer to maintaining surface flows when levels in the productive aquifer are dropping. So these types of questions in the projects that we're involved in, they're just statements such as maintaining the integrity of the Braid Plain Aquifer is key to managing river flow, temperature and groundwater recharge in the dry season. These are statements from our research partners, which they're also saying to the regional council. That I've struggled to reconcile how we still, in the plan, the proposed limit is 90 million cubic metres a year. So in my view, it's better to trust the actual data. And we see that every year we're getting lower and lower readings of groundwater levels in the dry season, not only in this area, but also on the peripheries at Bridge Park, which we've shown you before. And trusting the model, I guess, yes, we have to make some predictions, but as we've been emphasised by my colleagues here, it is about all available data. So that's sort of, I guess, what I just wanted to start out with. And now I just want to go into how I, the justification for the 70 million cubic metres a year. And yes, in our first, I guess, the lot of hearings at the Mangaro Marae, we basically, there was a ins and outs table or dynamics water balance table from Mr. Rakowski's report. I think it was 78 odd million cubic metres per year. table in that report, summary table, which at that point in time was, I guess, easy enough in our view to say, hey, look, this is what the council's own data have suggested. In delving further into the numbers and I guess using Mr. Waldron's revised numbers for water use over the period 2006 right up to 2020, we see that, and I explained it in my subsequent brief of evidence, that where we act conservatively, we could say it is on average 70 million cubic meters a year, or 74 I think is said on the average, but taking the lower bound of that would be 70. So I guess in in the panel's questions to the council, it was, is 90, where does this come from? Okay, it's 2012. We've already heard that that was decided upon as the limit that was going to go into the plan as a result of a planning meeting here in this very building, in this room. And I guess the reliability of supply, the 95%, was backfilled. For my estimate for 70, this is what we've used over that period of time, 2006 to 2014. It had an estimate of variance around which we could have some certainty, and that included the 2012 year, the driest year as well. And so when your question, I guess, to the council asking if the 90 million cubic meters a year was so there was a question about over allocation and whether you weren't certain whether that had resulted in effects or adverse effects from abstraction. And I guess to my mind, that wasn't answered really in the council's response. And neither was the question answered about the change from 50 million cubic meters a year for irrigation to 35 that I posed in my subsequent brief of evidence. So, just going back to the question that was asked about confidence. And really, I have to say the ability for tangata whenua to say, or the ability for the council to say or suggest there is no adverse effects on abstraction now really flies in the face of the observations that we see. And this is, as my colleague has pointed out, in the context of, again, a wholesale change in land use, intensification, and I find it very likely that there will be a call for emergency water in the next few years, as when the next drought does happen, and these large 2D plantings of apples, in that vulnerable stage, looking to, they're in a period of stress. So I'm very concerned that that the allocation limit, even an interim allocation limit, 90, it's already sort of at a level where we're seeing stress and negative effects in areas that are vulnerable to dropping water levels. And again, I reiterate what my colleague has said, alternatives, and we've discussed this, somewhat with our groundwater colleagues, is a series of monitoring wells that actually look at water level. So that would be the alternative. And setting limits on water level. I think this was discussed during the tank collaborative process, but it never went anywhere. Yes, there's great difficulties involved, and but we've got some pretty good information with the SkyTemp data having come through now. So that's all I'd like to say today.
Thank you. Do we have any quick questions? Your paragraph 11 of your supplementary evidence, where you say your own calculations estimate an average of 39.8 plus or minus 4.4 million cubic metres was abstracted for irrigation over 2006 to 2014. Can you just summarise for us how you reached those numbers? What information
That was
rely on?
from that's from that plot there that Mr. Waldron provided in his evidence, his supplementary evidence, where he revised the volumes.
So that's on page, is it 9 of his, I think it's appendix 10.
Yes, from that. And then my is obviously, so it's adding all of the irrigation and frost amounts, and then deriving a estimate of variance.
So, I don't understand how you get a 95% confidence interval. What's that based on?
95% confidence interval from each annual allocation, or is it use, is it consented groundwater pumping? Yes, it's pumpage. So that's the confidence interval over that period of time.
Right. And I guess I'm trying to get a feel for this issue of uncertainty and what it really relies on. Is it a cumulative level of concern? Because my understanding from the reports is that, I'm just trying to find it's actually in the appendix 11 memo that talks about the groundwater model that was developed, overseen by the Technical Advisory Panel of national and international experts. The model is, after calibration, was, basically a high degree of accuracy for these types of groundwater models. And I think they described it as a step change in terms of having an evidence base on which to evaluate the effects of human activities on water resources in the Heretaunga Plains. So, for my reading of that, the groundwater model is pretty good by groundwater model standards. So that's one. Okay, there are still some issues there, but that's one area of certainty or uncertainty. And then we go into the how much water has actually been abstracted and the calculations involved around that, model versus metered data. And we've got Mr. Waldron's memo here, which explains that and how he's revised those figures. And it looks to be, on face value, a certain amount of
improvement in the accuracy of those estimates. So that there's two sort of sets of issues or data that have their own uncertainties, but they do also look like they've improved over time in terms of the way they've been calculated. So is a concern still with those, the way that those models and estimates of abstraction have been undertaken, or is it more to do with the way that information has been turned into policies and rules in Plan Change 9?
I think it's a little bit of both. Just focus on the model and its development and the numbers supporting it. So I would say that if you had, I think there's probably two camps in the groundwater world looking at a system such as this that is very is highly connected. Well, the influence of recharge has a huge influence on the ability for pumpage from it in a sustainable manner, and I think that is what we're just really starting to get our heads around, and the training of the river, and this is, I guess, kind of what we're seeing in the last little while down in Canterbury with the floods there, and the fact that we've trained our rivers, and these are they're connected issues. We've tried to, in this process, I feel, put those aside, say research is undergoing here, we're going to revise things at some future point, but I think they really need to be considered now, which is this model, the conceptual setting of it. I don't think it fully appreciates the effect of the change in the recharge area over the period of time, from 2006 even, and this is something that I'm bringing up to you as I've been told from our research partners, and so there's that aspect. There's the conceptual setting of it. It's one I guess. The dogma is that it's water take driven, it's usage driven, the dynamics of the aquifer. And the alternative is, no, it's a combination of recharge, dynamics, and usage as well. And so what I'm saying is the emphasis here in this model, and as Mr. Enright's pointed out as well, is that it hasn't taken account really of the recharge to the extent that that to my mind, the uncertainty that provides in the numbers might be good, but the conceptual setting of it, I don't think, that's still debatable. So there's that component. The numbers that, as you say, that are coming out from usage, they're getting better. I've no problem with those. I think that assists the process. So that's not my issue really. It was about, the question was from the panel, 90 million, is that sustainable? And going forward, in our opinion, and from the advice we've been given by research partners, is, well, that's very questionable.
So the 90 is my reading of the information. The 90 was based on the 2012-13 year, when extremely dry, lots of abstraction going on, and the amount of water being abstracted was probably representing 95% reliability. And if the modelling is saying if that level of abstraction were to continue, the groundwater levels wouldn't continue to all other things being equal, including climate, etc. The groundwater levels wouldn't continue to decrease, but they would remain low. That's your understanding? Not,
Yes,
and
yes.
the level of stream depletion presumably would remain at their current levels.
That's our assumption, and we've been led to believe, yeah. I'm saying that, I question that, because we haven't taken into account the loss of storage over time, and the ability for this recharge area of the river, that the integrity of that has been maintained to keep it at the level that the model predicts. And so, in saying that, I'm also saying, well, even at the current level, we've got adverse effects occurring in connected rivers and streams.
But isn't the plan also saying that? It's not as if it's ignoring
They
it.
haven't, yes, but they haven't explicitly said that, I don't believe.
Okay.
Mr. Smith, you you're asserting that the channelization of the river for flood protection will have reduced groundwater losses to the Hiratonga Plains groundwater. And then you keep referring to research partners. Who are these research partners, and can we have a copy of their evidence, please?
The research is ongoing, so
Well, we can't evaluate it if we don't have it.
well, as you know, research is a sort of with every question that's answered, 10 more come from it, and so it's ongoing. And what I'm saying to you is that some of the preliminary findings are very interesting.
Well, who are these research partners, please?
The research has been conducted by, so in the Bridgepar area, we've just had a model for that particular area completed by GNS. And then also in this particular area, so GNS are doing a nationwide modelling exercise, and then they're also doing regional scale models. And then if you zoom in even sort of more in this recharge area, there's a project called the Braided Rivers Project, which is being conducted by Lincoln Agritech.
With others.
We're just gonna have a 5-minute recess, sort of break. Thanks.
Yeah, the question remains, if we haven't got the information, we can't evaluate it.
If it's held by council, you can make directions to council around that information.
Okay, thank you.
Just going to take a 5-minute break, thanks.
Ryder's question, if I might. And if you go to Council's reply memorandum dated 24 September, it's the same, bar chart diagrams.
Yes. That's question 5 there.
Question 5, yes. So what's interesting is it does say or acknowledge that in the sort of second to last paragraph on page 4, there is very high confidence in water use estimates from 2017 because at least 95% was meted of abstraction, and goes on to comment that abstraction calculated for 2012 is approximately 20% greater than 2019 and may be overestimated. So, sort of as a starting point, we're in the 80 million category, not if you allow for the very important issue, which was, your question, the panel's question around confidence levels. And so we're not in the 90, we're, more in the 80 than the 90. And then, of course, the other point, and you'll be familiar with the idea that all models are wrong, some are useful. One of the problems with this model is it does not include the cultural dimension, Mātauranga Māori. So it does actually miss out some of that equation. And hence our criticism is, we say anyway, valid. But if we were to rely on the model as Dr. Ryder said in question, basically, if we rely at the 90 million abstraction level, groundwater will remain low and stream depletion remain as it is, and that isn't good enough in terms of what we're meant to be achieving under the NPS, which is, on board the health and well-being. So actually, on Council's own model, we won't achieve what we're meant to be achieving in terms of the Te Mana o Te Wai priorities. Thank you.
Mr. Cowie had a further question.
You said in your paragraph 16 that amendments made to Appendix 11 are relevant to my recommended allocation limit. Can you tell me how exactly, please? Because the way I read the amendments, and remembering it's a technical report, the only change in any number is from 50 million to 35 million, which was an error in the original report. There's nothing else I read in technical terms that changes anything else.
Okay, I wasn't aware that it was an error. The change from 50 to 35. I mean, it was originally in the Aqualink report, and so I wasn't aware that there was an error as such. More than anything, it allowed us to refine our and provide some more confidence to the 70 million, if anything, and so that's why, as I said, there was a need to go back and check which, in the additions, deletions, edits, what each of those amendments, how they changed our original submission. So that was an example which I sort of worked through, I guess, was the change from 50 to 35.
Are there any other particular examples you can point me to, please?
Not, I can't off the top of my head. I suppose I picked up on that one because it was, it was so clear, and there was no mention of it being an error anywhere, I think, from memory. It was a change.
So that's the only one you can point to at the moment?
right now, yes.
Did you have any other questions? No. Okay. Mr. Enright, I think we're going to hear from Ms. Wilson.
Yes, thank you, yes.
You sorry, I'll just defog myself here.
Yes, it is a bit of an issue.
Thanks, and good to see you all again. I'll probably, as a starting point, try to speak to the second part of your question, Dr. Ryder, around is the concern around uncertainty, just about the number as such, or the model and how we got there, how we got to that number. Is it also around how it is or isn't used in plan provisions? And I would say yes, it very much. That is a significant part of the concern, and I think the number, the interim limit, or what's being called the interim limit of 90 million, came into play fairly late in the game in terms of the development of PPC 9. It came in, as Mr. Toyik has said, at a RPC meeting in this very room, and then a lot of the other provisions in PPC 9 had already been developed, so that it wasn't that the plan was developed around that number or a limit as such, and it was very much at the pushing of Ngāti Kahungunu to get a limit in at all. And I think even if we park the number for a moment, there's concerns that the rest of the plan doesn't necessarily do what potentially officers purport it to do. So I agree with looking at Ms. Robotham's response to the panel in terms of the questions that you asked and looking at those policy implications. And she talks about on page 7 and 8 around council planners needing strong tools to be applying this, where possible, reducing allocation where possible through a sinking lid approach and avoiding any increase in adverse effects while providing a pathway for further information gathering and using the actual and reasonable limit approach. And I agree with all of that sentiment. What I don't agree is that the plan actually does that as currently worded. The plan, particularly in the policies and objectives, and policies, is very much based on this. And harking back to Mr. Enright's comments around that overall broad balancing approach, that is how the objectives of this plan are set out. They're purported to be on the basis of the stakeholder process. We have to provide for everybody's values through that, rather than setting out a hierarchy, which we now have to do under the NPS FM20. So the changes that are set out in my evidence in chief aim to bring in some of that hierarchy and be much more clear about where the environmental bottom lines need to come in, where that allocation limit actually is articulated through the objectives and policies framework, and bring some structure to how you would then consider applications if they were to be made and in going into the future. And I think, reflecting back on a comment you made, Dr. Cowie, around, that we haven't done planners caucusing on provisions, and I think the comment you made was that you felt that the positions were too far apart for that to be useful. And I think that's probably been an opportunity lost, because I think there are actually some changes that are available to the panel to make that aren't entirely far off. If particularly we look at what Ms. Robotham has said in her response, and if we look at that and give weight to that, I think there are some very clear changes that can be made really to the objectives and policies framework. And some of those do include certainly, I guess, raising, to your point, Commissioner Kirikiri, raising the visibility of the matters of importance to Tangata Whenua within that objectives framework, so that those are clear. And particularly if the panel's going to look at a lesser activity status, there was seemed to be some potentially consideration of a discretionary activity status for new takes. No, did I not understand that? Okay,
No,
non-compliant. Okay.
The questions were really wanting clarifications, particularly in that regard. It seemed that some of the provisions on the face of it appeared to be prohibitive activities, not actually the activities class that it's set in the plan. So we're just wanting to clarify a number of those matters.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good thing because, yeah, what I would have said was I think that's a further, because then, if we're, because one of the questions that we've talked about as a team too is if there were, I think in her closing evidence, Ms. Robotham talking about, and to your point, Mr. Chair, talking about the need to make some new water available. And my question around that is how are those takes going to be assessed if we're looking at, to date, to my experience and my knowledge of what's going on consenting-wise, the district councils have done some work in terms of robust, modelling exercises and whatnot and very in-depth assessments of the effects of their takes on the aquifer, but are we expecting irrigators to do that each time, and how are we going to capture those cumulative effects of the takes, particularly if we do have a higher allocation limit that sits at that 90? So really just, I guess, gently reminding the commissioners, if I can, that there are some, whilst the number is important, there are other provisions and other changes that need to be made to the provisions within the plan to strengthen the overall effect and the structure that's there to, I think, achieve possibly what council is setting out to achieve and what they're stating they're wanting to achieve. But my assessment of the plan as currently drafted is that it won't necessarily do that.
Okay, do we have any questions?
It would be helpful in terms of if you think it's worthwhile asking the planners to conference, and I don't think it's a missed opportunity, we still have that opportunity, to specify back to us, perhaps through Mr. Enright, what other specific matters that you think could be, because we don't want to open up the whole shooting box, if you
I'm
like.
glad Mr. Dr. Cowie put his arms out. This plan change is quite comprehensive.
But if you could come back to us with the matters that you think it would be useful for that to be constrained to, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
With all of the usual provisos relevant to the matters under submission, etc.
Noted.
That'll just be a list of bullet points.
Thank you. That was helpful. I think we might open it up for questions. I'm just going to check through because I think Dr. Cowie might have asked all of my remaining questions. Did you have any questions? Okay. Specific ones? Oh, Mr. Smith, it's the same question, but I just wanted to follow it up again. Particularly, it's related to those matters where you were looking at there are a number of measures that could be implemented, and whether you'd covered off those matters. I've made some notes of those things that you had. Were there any others that are on your mind of measures? This is over and above, in additional to the 70 million meters allocation. Other measures that you thought were appropriate.
So I think one of the, certainly in the area around the aquifer edges is ensuring that addressing those fundamental issues rather than using mitigation measures, which in this case, and which Mr. Tioka explained, we're supporting the whānau from Mangaro Marae to undertake some course measurements of flow in the tributaries leading into the Paritua, Kāreorewa, and so that we don't, there's not a need, or to understand how much reliance is on the water drafted off from the Ngariroro, which, as we've talked about, may be contributing to that increased connectivity because through the dissolution of that sealant layer. So, we're talking now about potentially, weirs and wetland development, and potentially even targeted sections of sealing in some way the stream. So that's the rest, the enhancement aspect of it, I suppose. From the monitoring perspective, what I was talking about before was, rather than, so we have low flow cutoffs and connected rivers and streams, and this was brought up, as I said, in the tank collaborative process, which was cut-off levels or trigger levels approaching a certain groundwater limit in a particular area, a groundwater level rather. So as we observe the groundwater level in a particular area dropping, then there's an alert given and some activity is undertaken with that prospect in mind. Instead of relying on the dropping stream, flow, like for example, the Raupare, where then they add water to it from the groundwater. So that's an alternative, and I'll leave it there. But yeah, in terms of the monitoring, for adverse effects, that is certainly an alternative approach, which I've have discussed with colleagues, groundwater colleagues, and definitely it's more difficult, but it's done overseas.
Thank you. Just in regards to Mr. Chuka, I've just got a couple of ones here.
If I could just add to the research that Shadesmith touched on, other research partners, there's a number of parties included in that, including not just ourselves, Lincoln Agritech, but NIWA and Regional Council. So we're all privy to the same information and presentations, whether it's published or not. Understanding the recharge is obviously a huge input consideration, whether now or going forward. So Regional Council are privy to the discussions, and it is available to them just as much as what's been made available to us. It's signed contract partners to that.
Just in regards to your evidence, Mr. Chuka, I just had one, probably both clarifications. I'm just looking at paragraphs 13 to 15 around the cultural considerations, and I just wanted to make sure that that's what you'd covered off earlier in terms of your view that those cultural matters, including Mātauranga Māori, hadn't been included or accounted for in the model. That covered off those matters there.
Yeah. In tandem with the monitoring, that it should be part of it. I guess that hasn't progressed where we're still discussing issues around what exactly we should be monitoring and the connected policy and objectives, because we don't want monitoring to sit in a space isolated from meaningful policy and objectives. Otherwise, what's the point of monitoring? Failing that, we don't think that obviously the observations in the work, and what we're doing and Shade's doing, should be equally ignored in the space of no other data. The best available information.
And just the last
Sorry,
one.
can I just speak to that?
Yeah.
If you go back to, again, the key findings which are in that paper I handed out, key findings page 9, and it referred, I referred to it earlier, but aquifer is reaching a new equilibrium. So is that really the absolute minimum outcome we want from Plan Change 9, rather than some wins on the board in relation to restoring stream flow, restoring the ability to harvest tuna, all those things we heard about at the marae in week 1. It's kind of quite a minimalist aspiration. It's not courageous, and it doesn't reflect, as we have said more than once, the hierarchy for Te Manawa Te Wais. So if that's what our model delivers, the model isn't delivering enough. is our argument.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on the point I'm trying to get at, really, is just how, well, I mean, I've asked to throw the question at Mr. Smith and Mr. Tiuka, would be acknowledging that the various aspects of what people refer to as cultural things are in the mix at the moment. My question would be, but how adequately do you think they are being covered or being addressed? It's one thing having it there on paper or in front of you. It's quite another to then get a bead on just how well they're being addressed or, you know, attended to, if that's the right word. And I think that's one of the key issues around any of these kind of these kind of resource consent exercises. It's how effectively those issues are picked up and dealt with. And if I use an example, I mean, the issue of kaitiakitanga, for example. Now, when I first looked at the application, it was quite silent on that. There wasn't a lot around that, you know, just kind of, and it's arguably true of a lot of resource consents at the moment. A lot of applications I've had to deal with in the past year or so, or couple of years, have been relatively silent on things like kaitiakitanga. There are assumptions made, I think, I'm not entirely sure, that people understand what that is, and the very fact that they're mentioned in passing seems to satisfy the process. But I would argue equally that it doesn't necessarily. You know, the baselines are quite different. I don't quite understand sometimes how the RMA process misses them. But to a large extent it does, and I think that's one of the real challenges here. I mean, both of you are making that point even now without saying it, well, as I'm listening. So I think for me anyway, on this particular hearing, the jury's still out a bit on that. I need to hear more about, I guess, what's really intended and what's really going to happen, as opposed to the, yeah.
I'll just start off there. Kia ora, this was my point I made at the beginning, if not throughout the hearings and throughout a tank. Essentially, the starting point in the future that's provided is a space of diminished mana. If our natural environment is the expression of our mana and the obligation of kaitiakitanga to protect what was provided to us, which is, hence, it's part of our pepeha, the streams, the waterways, not just the Ngāriroro, but obviously that's a major one, but the tributaries are also major expressions of our practices, our mahinga kai, and being able to provide. I know from experience, I don't put my hinaki in the big river, it will get swept away, I put it in the little one. And those are just as much part and parcel to our connection to the landscape. And if they're diminished, then as I've been taught, you're in a state of diminished mana and you're obligated to retain that or stay in that space of the diminished mana. That's an obligation. And if you don't want to prescribe to that, then perhaps you're not from those waterways. And that's the connectional difference. And we see the red and green lines that are in these scenarios, they're starting off at assuming a space or point at a high use, and all of a sudden this trend of going down, the hypothetical will stop and will be flatline and be good. That already starts off at a point for tangata whenua. And if, as you would have heard at the marae, they're scratching their heads what to do. And told, well, accept this new level of environment with little regard to how it's adversely affected, in my mind, little regard, or it's acceptable. And we're in a space or obligation, as you've said, and we haven't spelled it out, as advocates, or kaitiaki with obligation to preserve what was left for us. And now we're asked to preserve at this new state where it's quite diminished, or in some instances, springs no longer exist, or streams that have just run 12 months of the year. Is it a stream if it doesn't run for 12 months? I'll be on arguments that perhaps it's not a stream anymore, but we're told to accept that. And also I noticed in the, so much paperwork, but Pavel 2018 report that in the future, if it carries on this current trajectory, there'll be stream losses. Well, that's not the future, that's right now.
Yeah, yeah.
So the history of what's been happening is actually the present. And from our reading, it's going to be the future. And we've asked to reconcile that with entrenchment of an allocation limit, which diminishes, in my mind, our mana and our obligation to being kaitiaki over these waterways. Sorry.
And I think that probably harks back to your question, Dr. Ryder, about how that model is used, because then I think Mr. Smith's comment around backfilling, because I think it has, my impression around, and the changes to Appendix 11 as well, is that the model's been used to essentially justify the existing level of takes, and that is coming at a cost that is adverse effects on Tangata Whenua, as we've heard. And so I think that's where the concern around ownership of science and ownership and use of a model and the way that it's interpreted is coming into play. And I think I appreciate your line of question, Commissioner Kirikiri, around what the plan, what a plan actually does in terms of addressing those issues and concerns. And that's what I've attempted to do in terms of my suggested amendments, is really, again, elevate the status of those concerns and issues like kaitiakitanga, to give them full and proper weight that I think they must be given that full and proper weight under the RMA, irrespective of where we land on what we need to do with NPSFM 20. I think we already have that onus on us. And again, I think the plan has in some ways said that it's going to do that, or been purported to do that, but does not.
And just a short addition, I was just reflecting on the plan provisions exactly as Ms. Wilson just said, and in many ways it's more procedural than substantive when it comes to kaitiakitanga. So it's, it is recognising its input, but there's no actually deliverables. And it's quite intensely practical. The mahinga kai, being able to harvest, is an intensely practical outcome that you can achieve, but it would require more than what the model delivers. The model doesn't deliver kaitiakitanga. It just delivers the ability to continue at the current depleted levels. So there isn't the substance. Substance is not being delivered in my submission.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. Exactly. Thanks.
I had one last question for Mr. Chuka. I was just double checking. I don't think FMUs were part of the Appendix 11 per se, but you've included some draft Hawke's Bay Regional Council freshwater management unit maps,
Yes.
some of which I'm a little unfamiliar with. But my question is just, because this is something we've put to the council, and I've said this is my interpolation. That process is underway. It hasn't been completed. We don't have freshwater management units that you can incorporate or take recognition in terms of the NPSFM 2020. So I'm just seeking some clarification. Where do you understand the process for the FMUs is up to at this point in time?
We haven't been engaged at all, and I did capture your question at the end of previous hearings and what work has been done with Tangata Whenua. And I think the point was missed that why I provided these maps is that work had been done. It was proposed early on in Tank to establish freshwater management units, and for some reason, which I think is a logical planning step to put the values in a spatial context, that was left towards the end where I had raised it in the group, and we ended up having sidebar discussions to work out these maps, and it's unfortunate that that wasn't mentioned to the panel, and that this work had been brushed aside and gone to the planning committee with no connection to the work that's been done with Tangata Whenua, ourselves, the Tai Whenua, and all those who were engaged on that stakeholder group. So I provided those maps, which are obviously council maps, which was part of that. I think it was, we basically caucused on it. We assumed much to our, we shouldn't have made the assumption that that was going to be the part of the proposal going forward, and it just sort of so much going on, it was lost. But I don't think we should have lost sight of those discussions, which, being through the engagement process, we had obviously engaged with Tangata Whenua alongside the Tai Whenua for a number of years with Hapu to look at it, not only freshwater management, but involving our Hapu in terms of the management framework. So for that to be put aside and to start afresh, I mean, it's sort of picking and choosing when to talk. We did know that.
I suppose the panel's not in a position to say, oh, you should do this or you shouldn't do that in regards to the FMUs. That's part of that ongoing process. But it was really just wanting to get your perspective of where it's at for Ngāti Kahungunu. Certainly
We did
the council's position about where they are in that process. So
We did hear that we were going to be invited, and that was the wishes of the Tangata Whenua members, but we haven't received any formal invite or any update whatsoever.
Could I just add to that? There is reference in the council's memo to the panel to an email sent on the 6th of September as to FMUs. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that email, so I'm not sure quite what that said, but I'm sure we can get a copy. But you will recall there is a legal issue for you to determine around FMUs as to whether they're within scope, and you have my submissions on that. But DOC specifically sought, as part of its relief, addition of FMU, so we've submitted to you it's within scope.
yeah, I'll have to look. The email from memory is quite short, so I don't
Okay,
think there's any
well,
issue about providing that on the website.
Sure, I'm sure
Really
it
just
won't
to
be.
say that
We just
that-
haven't
that
seen it,
process
so we
was-
weren't sure what
Yeah,
it
was
said.
not, it hadn't been completed or was in the very formative stages of starting. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just checking, I don't think we have any further questions.
Thank you. I think from our perspective, again, we just want to reiterate thank you for the opportunity to address you on these important issues, and we'll retire to the back benches. Kia ora. Thank you.
It's important for me to acknowledge the time and effort that gone into producing evidence ahead of this hearing, and it's good to have been able to do that in person. And thanks, Ms Wilson, also for coming along and sharing your thoughts and the information you provided. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm just going to stretch our legs while Mr. supplementary minutes, and what I think it might be a good thing is giving us 10 minutes to have a read of it.
Yeah.
Because what will happen is we'll be reading this and not listening to you. If we try and do those two things at once. So with your leave, what we'll do is we're just going to take 10 minutes to have a read of this, and then we'll make a start if that's okay.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Uti rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tēnā koutou I roto I te manakitonga o te kaihanga nāna I homai te tīmatanga te mutunga, nāna nei I homai tēnei kaupapa wahanga kai mui a mātou. He honore, he kororia ki te whenua maungarongo, ki te whenua whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Nō reira, he mihi kawake kia tātou ina homai nei I raro I te tūni a tātou nei whare. Kei a koe te rangatira Pierre, ti matai me te karakia, ka tū ki te rangi, ara kia he mihi kawake e rā ngā Celestials, ki hono, ara mātou o te terrestrial world, ka puta e te tino whakaro moi a ka ora te tangata, ka ora te wai, ka ora te pūtaiao. Nō reira, he mihi kawake ki a koe, Antoine, toko rima ngā kai kumihana kai whakawā, me ki tēnei kaupapa, nō reira, mai te tino whanaunga bubble o Ngāti Kahungunu, rāua nei ko te tauwhenua Heritaunga, he mihi tino ake kia koutou ara me kia hoki mai I roti te riu o Ngāti Kahungunu rohe ara me ki māua nei, Maori Black, ngā waha kōrero mō te tauwhenua o Heritaunga. E tautoko ana ki ngā tini mate aitua, ina nahi rā no te whānau o Tamate rohe, Dick Hawe. Ko ia he mahi ana ki wainga tēnei tēpū I taua wā, rā me ki te whānau tukuru. Nō reira, hoi anō āpiti hono te tātai hono, hunga mate rātou ki a rātou āpiti hono te tātai hono, te hunga ora e tau nei, tēnei timi atu. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, kia ora mai anō tātou katoa. Kia ora. Just want to preface a whakatauki. It goes something like this. Whaia koe, ki te iti kahurangi, ki tū ohu koe, ki maunga teitei. I guess some of the mahi that's before us that's quite challenging, and in reflection of this particular whakatauki, what it makes is that we must continually start to look at pushing whatever the decisions to the greatest heights, to the stars, to the clouds. And if by some chance we kind of miss the stars and the clouds, we arrive on a lofty mountain. So he whakaaro noi hoi pāno me ki te kaupapa kai mui a mātou. Aro, Antoine, nō reira hoi anō, tēnei timi atu, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'm going to be playing the scroll operator for very much part of this morning's, if we've got probably that of the day left, Paupai Tango Tara, and I just want to hand and hoi anō te rākau taku ho kaimahi a Morris. Kei a koe te wāhewa.
Perhaps before Mr Black starts, just to acknowledge that we've received your comprehensive further submissions, so we've had an opportunity to have a read of that.
Aye.
And we've just had a quick read of the evidence provided for us today. I don't think there's going to be a need for you to read through it, but it would be quite important, just because we've just read it, if there's particular points you want to draw our attention to, that would be really helpful. And I think we'd like to spend as much time with you asking questions and having a bit of a discussion.
All right.
If that's okay.
No, thank you for that. So just the issues there in paragraph 6 summarised, the key points there. I guess around potential adverse effects on water quality, which is connected to abstraction, and around how when you get stream depletion and the sucking in of lower quality water into our aquifers, which is for the Heritaunga Plains aquifer system, is sort of something that is protected in terms of RPS policy objective 21. So if I go down to paragraph 8, so we have the Heritaunga Plains aquifer system, and then we have the map or the schedule 31E, which is And there's discrepancy in policy around managing the Hiratonga Plains aquifer system on the one hand, and then including the wider the groundwater management area, and was wanting to seek clarity around the numbers in terms of, in some reports, the 90 million applies to the Hiratonga Plains aquifer system, but then you have things in Schedule 31E where you have Matapiro, you have groundwater there, you have the Motior system, you also have bits going out to Marae Kākaho, and so to which bit does that 90 million apply, and how do you reconcile the 90 million for the Hiratonga Plains aquifer system with what happens in the wider catchment with groundwater in the groundwater management area? So trying to clarify whether they are both the same, because it's difficult to connect Matapiro groundwater, which is across the river. So you go out past Omahu, hang a left out there, and out by Matapiro Station, and all those brothers, is it Ford's brothers out there, and some of the upper twos as well. So that land out there, the connection between that and the Hiratonga Plains aquifer system is, I don't understand that in terms of the 90 million. So I want a bit of clarification around that. Moving on, so we're talking about sustainable yield. I note in the groundwater memo that came out last week, there was a question around trying to reconcile the reduction in groundwater levels. You had around average 5 centimetres per year between 1989 and 2018. If you add another year, you come up with a 20-year time span, times 5 centimetres is a metre. So a metre of loss of storage over that 20-year time frame. You run the numbers and you come up with quite a large number in terms of over the whole aquifer area. So how can, and then when you look at the model that implies that you can, if you run it for another 100 years, it's sort of sustainable. And then if you have 100 years times 5 centimetres, you have another 5 metres of decline. So I can't agree that the model is producing or steering us towards a sustainable level of abstraction at that 90 million, when less than 90 million contributes to that continual 5 centimetre decline per annum. Moving on to actual and reasonable use, I don't see tangata whenua in that picture at all. We're putting up with the results of that actual and reasonable use, and that decline that I mentioned before, that occurs at abstraction volumes less than the 90 million. Surface water depletion rates. So paragraph 16, I'll jump there. So 1,700 litres per second comes out to over 53 million per annum. And then we have figures from Mr. Smith. He was adjusting something from 50 million down to 35 million, I think. The numbers in his reply to questions in terms of, I think there was 40 million for one, for domestic, something else for industrial, and then in the paper I see, hey, there's another 550 houses going up somewhere in Napier, outskirts of Napier. So these numbers are changing all of the time. The demand is changing all of the time, and there's also, oh no, I'll move on from that. That's just moving the numbers out so that we get a more accurate picture of how much is coming out of our streams, and we have to put up with the results of that. I've outlined in paragraph 19, I've just outlined a couple of RPS objectives which are directive, and so they need to, the Plan Change 9 needs to give effect to those. And in paragraph 20, just noting, I think Mr. Tiuka pointed this out as well, around the maintenance of the quantity of water in water bodies and coastal water, and connecting that back to the NPS FM's priority settings. So there's that conflict between regional councils' presumption that decline is all right, but then their statutory role is to maintain the quantity. Water take criteria management. So how we just that the consents have been rolled over. I think a lot of them. 600, I think I brought up in my submission in July. And then in May next year, there's a few hundred more expiring, and so on and so forth. But then they are operating under Section 124, which is they have to continue to operate under their existing consents. Their existing consents promote far greater than the 90 million. So going off some reports, varying numbers around what the total allocation is. I note that Belinda Harper, what were we doing? I think it was Plan Change 7, yeah. And so in there, when she was doing an analysis of the Hiratonga aquifer, she came up with 161 million had been allocated. So addressing over-allocation as required by the NPS doesn't actually address the over-abstraction, or what we perceive as over-abstraction and unsustainable use that then contributes to the effects, adverse effects on our stuff. I'll move on from that. I'll go on to, just noting there, paragraph 27, that's just Plan Change 7 is in process now. Decisions have come out, it's under appeal. We're heading for mediation. Couple of the things that the Tai Whenua was seeking through that process, I know it's separate from this one, but water bodies in common. And just that in our original submission, we asked for a table of outstanding water bodies to be included in Plan Change 9, because Plan Change 7 is relying to some extent on the values of outstanding water bodies being explained or expressed through Plan Change 9. And also in our original submission where we sought the addition of a table or schedule similar to, from memory, Schedule B in the one plan, where they have all those values lined out and you ticks for certain ones and blanks for some other ones. And to me that is a simple method that everyone can understand rather than getting tangled up in policies and rules and things that sometimes they get a bit circular. Right, just going over a bit of uncertainty around, I'll get onto the table there in paragraph 28. So this is directly from the old Dravid and Brown report. And those ones in yellow that I've highlighted, submarine outflow. Also in the Dravid and Brown report, they refer to there's a potential that it's a closed system. So, and then if you're taking out 80, 90 million, whatever you're taking out from the groundwater, you're not getting that weight pushing through to the marine outfall if it does exist anymore. I think the original thing was a reference to a naval chart or something where it had been identified, the marine springs, but nobody's been able to locate them anymore. There was some work done on salinity, I think in the 70s, and the salinity around the location at depth, there wasn't any difference. So as the irrigation from groundwater has grown, what's happened that is the aquifer pressures have reduced. I know instances, I used to chase around some of the groundwater take things, not a lot of them, because most of them were non-notified, but some of the ones that were notified, around Jervois Town, Miani, I had bore logs and things from there. You had water coming up 4 metres above ground. Now they're like back down at ground level. So the pressure behind that water is greatly reduced. Okay, that'll do on that. The other thing that I want to point out here is around drainage dewatering. So on that table there, it's like table 1. It's got a 3 million cubic metres for drainage dewatering. We were involved in a consent just a month or so ago, and it was around the dewatering the shallow aquifer out around Twyford. So out around Twyford, Ropare, you have this upward pressure. And what's happening now is that with all of these new root stocks, dwarf root stocks, they don't like having wet feet for too long. And so the orchardist out there, he wanted to drain that water out of the aquifer and put it into the Tweedy drain that then goes into the Ropare stream. So the consent has been approved. But the volumes just for that one were up to 66 litres a second. So when you roll those numbers out, it's 40,000 odd cubic metres a week, and then over 30 weeks, 1.2 million. And that's only one consent. So it's sort of set a precedent. The consent is actually from from groundwater and water held in sumps. So if that's happened, that's sort of first one off the block, I guess, and it's whether that's likely to happen again. Everyone is keeping a close eye on it, but it's set a precedent for other people around the area who also may want to de-water the shallow aquifer around orchards that have dwarf rootstock. Okay, paragraph 30 is just the two latest State of the Environment reports, and just highlighting again those red dots are still there, which are the, in the square, the top square is Heretaunga. The red dots are the lowest levels ever reached for July and August over the whole period of record, and the yellow ones are below normal. So heading into this irrigation season, groundwater is pretty low at the start of the season. In my submission, so I'm probably being, in our original submission and in my evidence, we sort of asked for separation of the aquifer into different parts. We didn't actually ask for this many, but because of the ability to transfer water, I think it needs to be managed very carefully. If you're looking at Motior groundwater up there, it's like it's that's in decline as well. And if you look back at that figure 1 there, Motior are those 3 top red dots in the second picture there. So that's the Motior Valley up there. So lowest level ever recorded up there. And when there's the ability to transfer water takes, I think the policy has around where the pressure or something is equal, but it also needs to be restricted so that you're not transferring a water take into an area that is already under stress. Paragraph 37, I'll just touch on that briefly, is part of the Tuki Tuki catchment is under Plan Change 6, which is already operative, and the Tuki Tuki aquifer sort of overlies the Heretaunga aquifer. Although the Tuki Tuki loses water to the Tuki Tuki aquifer, there's a presumption in some of the mathematics, I guess, that all reaches the Heretaunga aquifer system. Some of it is intercepted before it actually gets there. And there's frost protection, irrigation takes, a bit of cropping in that takes water out of that aquifer. And it's how much is regulated under another part of the plan rather than lumping the 70 million or 80 million, whatever figure we arrive at, all under the tank allocation. So that's just around, probably needs dividing it up between the different parts of the aquifer in that respect. This is a groundwater budget, paragraph 38. So Dravid and Brown didn't have all that Tuki Tuki water in there. And then there's the LSR calculation. I don't have much faith in that amount of rainfall actually remaining in the aquifer, in the shallow aquifer, due to different things. They have I've explained some of it there about the quick flow. They've made a bit of an allowance for that as runoff. But then there's a lot of tile drainage and stuff, subsurface drainage out there, particularly on cropping land, where that is actually lost to surface water as well. So just a bit of disagreement, I guess, with their assumptions there. Table 3, I've just, Table 3 and Table 4, I've just put the numbers into cubic metres rather than just litres per second. So the 435, I can't quite. Oh yeah, that one's for Tutaikuri Waimate, but when the spring flow from the Motior Valley that feeds into the Tutaikuri Waimate is around 750. So 435 litres per second of that is intercepted, so no longer reaches the stream. Rainfall inputs, I've been over some of that. And then 46, the conclusions that I've made from that. Paragraph 50, I don't know whether this is entirely accurate. I was trying to figure out the numbers and going by that one cubic metre decline over the whole aquifer. It's a huge number. Storage within the aquifer from Draven and Brown, I think it's 1.4 billion or something like that. And this seems like a heap of water to lose. Well, what we're experiencing now is, excuse me, is the annual retreat, I guess, of the aquifer from around Bridge Pa, Pakipaki, or Mahu, around that edge there. And then I also provided in my, at one of the previous hearings, those, in my evidence in chief, some of those other groundwater SOE results. And what was noticeable is that a lot of them, or several of them, were up around the recharge area with a lot of red dots up there. And I think that one, from memory, was taken from Harper 2015 or something, his report. So what we're getting is that water's getting intercepted before it recharges the main part of the aquifer, and this is causing problems in terms of, we have transmissivity, I guess, as a characteristic of an aquifer, which is a potential groundwater movement through that aquifer. But when you take the weight of the water, the decrease in the weight of the water pushing through due to hundreds of wells and their cones of depression expanding, how they interfere with the flow of water, all the natural flow of water through that, and just cognizant that the RPS has a policy around protecting the integrity, actually it's in an objective actually, around protecting the integrity of the aquifer recharge. And fair enough, people want to take water, but I think we probably need to wind it back a little bit so that that recharge is not compromised too much. I'll leave it there and open to any questions and do my best to respond to them.
Kia ora, Maury. For fear of sounding like I'm on a stuck record,
Yeah.
I just want to pick up your para 48. And the point you make there about the model not quantifying or predicting what is required to meet tangata whenua values. And I'd like to get your elaboration on that. I mean, you know, can you sort of quantify that a bit more for us?
All right, we were invited to the early stages of the model when I think it's probably, I think it was a couple of modelers ago. It's they don't seem to stay long. But anyway, Travatha? So we had a bit of a one-on-one about modelling, and I thought we were going to have input to the model so that our perspectives would then transfer into the model. I'll just, I think it's Objective 2, and Tank Objective 2 says something about incorporating Māori values and things in the management of fresh land and fresh water, something like that. I'm just paraphrasing, but the model didn't do that. So we're not in on the model parameters as tangata whenua, as hapu. So then we're not reflected in the outcomes of the model. We have to address the results of the model and come and tell you fellas that, hey, it doesn't address our concerns, which is a bit back to front. There was the opportunity to provide that input, but I think we only went to about 3 meetings, and then the modelling thing carried on for another couple of years. I guess it was an opportunity lost, yeah. But with the values on the springs and the surface water as well, how we're left with the results of the modelling, the 1,700 litres per second, whatever it is, stream depletion overall, and, you know, the Bridge Park case, about their wai out there, and also around Pakipaki. I know Auntie Wā out there, now and again, she'll ring up a certain farmer and scream at him, and he'll release a bit of water. But even our allocation there, if it's almost like we can put it into the river and into the Paritua, but it gets taken out. So in some ways we're only supplementing the abstractors.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't actually get to Bridge Par anyway. So what I see is that the surface water allocation thing and the stream depletion thing and the whole problem for tangata whenua, or the whole issue, becomes compounded. And when you get farmers, they'll divert this little bit of a creek here, and so they get a better, I guess, better area to work with for whatever they do. But then the Y on top is connected to the Y underneath. If you move the Y from the top and shove it over there, there's a little bit of water will persist through the ground, but because it hasn't got its kazi as well to help sustain it and replenish it, that will gradually dry up. And that's happening everywhere. When I drive in from Pātangata, they're doing it on the side of the road. The farmers are just, and often someone will notice and say, hey, yeah, I've got a consent for that. Council gives them a consent retrospectively. And that's happened 4 or 5 times that I know of. But I'll stop there. I hope that explains.
Well, it does, but it also reinforces my own view of the inherent tensions that there are between tikanga or mātauranga Māori and what's often loosely referred to as Western science. Because that, to me, underpins some of the struggles we're having with this particular take now, which is not unlike the similar take around the country. I mean, the questions are essentially the same. There's an intrinsic difference, I suppose, that the system often finds it difficult to bolt together. You know, there's one bit saying something here and the other bit saying something else over here, and there's a strain that the process fails to come to grips with. And I mean, you made the point earlier on about you know, essentially having to be in a reactive mode. Stuff comes up, you need to react to it. And I mean, it's a challenge. I think I'd throw at any council or any principality that has to deal with water. You know, I mean, water is today's gold for the arguably.
Well, we have the you know, te mana o te wai, and it's like, it's operative now, and we're saying, well, you need to respect that mana, because that mana is a reflection of it, reflects on us.
Sure.
But then what comes back is, oh, I know te mana o te wai and how it's implemented needs to be decided by the whole region. And it's that sort of conflict. We know what mana means to us. We know how, if our stream or our river, whether the mana in that has been respected. But sometimes it loses something when it gets converted into a policy or something like that. And sure, we have objectives in that say, oh yes, we will incorporate the values and things of Māori or of tangata whenua into the management, but the policy doesn't allow for that. And then when the whole allocation thing that we're basing it on is actual and reasonable, it isn't actual and reasonable for us. It's actual and reasonable for water demand, which I see it as a little bit of a, no, I won't go there. It's depressing.
But that is a threat, the thrust of your message in here, is us here. I mean, I don't want to belabor the point, but I go so far as to say that these sorts of things are often a manifestation of the lens through which you look at them. You know? And I think that's one of the questions, that's one of the challenges. Depends what lens you're using to look at them. Yeah. Anyway, thanks very much, Mario.
Kia ora.
I'll just go on if I'm given the option.
Okay. Sorry, I've just lost the translation of him giving me the eyebrows. Yeah, no, I'm okay.
You said at the start of your presentation, I think you said that you couldn't understand how under PC9 if you kept the allocation or the abstraction at 90 million cubic metres, why the groundwater wouldn't stay in a sort of dynamic equilibrium state, given the fact that it's been declining over time at, I think you said 4 or 5 centimetres a year.
Yep.
But isn't that simply a reflection of the growth in groundwater pumping annually since about the mid-1980s or so, which has gradually increased, and in some periods it has increased quite sharply, and that's reflected in that gradual decline in the groundwater levels. So if you stop at that level of 2013 or so, why wouldn't you expect the groundwater not? Why would you consider it to keep declining?
I guess it's the shape of the aquifer and the rate of replenishment. So councils, not some of their fact sheets, I guess, they used to portray the aquifer as a saucer. And you know, it's a bit simplistic, but it was just to explain to people how it worked. So around the edges of the saucer, the water is shallow. Groundwater is relatively shallow. You're also getting water from the limestone aquifers that are coming in that is quite old water. So you'll get the odd pulse of rainwater coming in, but the base flow out around the edges is older water coming from the limestone springs and things like that. And then you're getting that gradual decline. It's in, I think it was in the memo, it was in somewhere about 5 centimetres per annum on average. And then, like I said, that if it declines roughly a metre in 20 years, and it hasn't slowed down. So what you're getting is the projection from the model saying that, oh, it'll be okay if we continue at that thing for the next 100 years. To me, that doesn't make sense. It's not logical.
But it's been declining because pumping rates have been increasing overall, though, hasn't it?
That's right. But the council's responsibility or their function under Section 30 is to maintain water quantity, not to enable gradual decline on and on.
What I'm just trying to clarify is that it's not the 90 million cubic metres of water is not. It's not saying if you keep it at that, it's going to improve the water levels. The water levels are still going to remain, and the ground is still going to remain low or depressed, whatever you want to describe it as.
Yep.
But it should arrest the further decline in groundwater levels.
But like Mr. Tiukas,
You don't accept that?
No, we can't, because that amount of decline is drying up our streams. It's drying up the veins that flow into our awa. It's drying up the inflow into our aquifer. It's all being intercepted before it reaches the main part of our aquifer. Sure, the ones with deeper wells in the middle around Tollymarsh Road and around the edges of Flaxmere and higher pressure around, was it east of the motorway, you know, where there's higher pressure, they'll be fine. But everyone, a lot of our marae around the edges.
I understand that. Thank you. I think you've also asked for a definition for degraded to be included.
Might have been, was it in this one or
No, in your
previous
first-
submission?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think you make the point or note that degraded is defined under the MPS, but your definition is more broader than that.
I think the one in here was about sustainable yield, was it? Definition for degraded.
Yes.
Well, I understand that in the NPS, degraded is related to an MFU. And when you don't have MFUs, the relationship with the word degraded is undermined. That's why I was asking for a definition of degraded to address that issue.
Okay. I think it's mentioned in the plan as it currently is worded, in a objective 4. That's the only place degraded's.
Yeah, hang on, just give us a
I
second.
I'm just wondering whether the way it's written there, whether that would meet your definitions.
Objective 4.
Yep, page 8. This is in the draft plan as presented at the
Oh, okay.
end of week 3.
Okay. No, sorry, I must have a wrong version. My objective 4 doesn't have. Oh, improved and degraded water bodies so that they meet attribute states in Schedule 26 by 2040. That's the only reference to degraded. It's not really a descriptor. Sorry, this is section 42A version.
What I really wanted to know is you think that doesn't go far enough in terms of...
No. I think it should, I'd like it to be tied to this plan will have to be reviewed, you know, for Kotahi that's coming up. And I think we just should get it connected to the NPS while we've got the opportunity now. By not having FMUs in there, there's that disconnect between the meanings in the in the NPS that are specifically tied to FMUs, but they're not tied to management areas or whatever we're calling them.
Okay, I understand that. Thank you. I've got no further questions. Dr. Cowan?
I refer you to paragraph 50, please, Mr. Blair.
50?
Yep.
Yep.
So in paragraph 50, you say Hiratonga aquifer storage has declined by more than 525 million cubic metres over the last 20 years.
Yep.
I can't find how you calculated that. Can you tell me how it was done, please?
Okay, in reference to the average decline per year of 5 centimetres per year between 1989 to...
I've got that part. How does that come out to 525 million?
The area in the Aqualink report, the study area, and it's reference made elsewhere around the aquifer spatial coverage is 52,500 hectares. And then if you take that decline of 1 cubic metre over that 52,500 hectares, that's the number you come up with. So hectares, 10,000 square metres. 1 metre deep is 10,000 cubic metres per hectare times 52,500.
So when you then that's not correct, is it? It's what you really mean is that it has declined by about.
Well, yeah, about is probably more accurate, but the thing is that the rate,
Now, former Prime Minister Sir John Key has very publicly
Sorry, was
No,
was that part of your response?
Yeah, PM.
yeah, it'd probably be more accurate to put about.
Okay, all I wanted to know was how you calculated
Yeah.
it, because I couldn't figure it out from the rest of the text.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I explained it in a footnote somewhere.
It doesn't matter, you've told me how you worked it out.
Yep.
That was the-
And that's, you know, average, going off that average.
Oh, sorry. I just had it, this is at paragraph 27 of your original further submissions, and it's, you might not need to go there, I can just probably explain it.
Yep.
It was a question around some of the provisions that might be in the coastal environment plan, and they may contradict with, so my understanding is the coastal environment plan, I'm not very familiar with that plan, does include some of the landward sections of the
Yeah, a
coast.
narrow coastal strip.
So where there might be an overlap, we'll call it, is where there's abstractions in the coastal environment area which have provisions for in the plan, and they may or may not contradict with any provisions that we come up with.
Well,
Change line.
I guess Schedule,
Is that what you're getting at? That's what I was
yeah,
trying to
yeah,
get
Schedule 31E
Yes,
goes right to the coast.
yes, that's right.
The tank plan or the RRMP governs the landward margin, but not that narrow coastal strip that goes all the way from
okay, so it's a
Napier
general-
out to Awatoto, and then it widens out a bit around Clive and around estuaries. So you get the water takes that are taken from there. Also, you're getting the domestic water takes, which I guess aren't large, but they're all part of the equation that are regulated under the coastal environment plan. So what I was getting at was this plan regulates tank catchments, but not those other bits. And similar to the Tuki, the lower Tuki, where the Tuki plan from the Board of Inquiry that is now operative includes management of some of that Tuki water right down towards the coast as well, and part of that aquifer.
Okay.
So you can't count it all in this plan. You can count the parts that are the spatial area for the tank catchments, but not those other parts that are part of the Heretonga aquifer system. That's why I asked for, hey, you need to change that map in a previous submission.
Thank you for that. And just last one, this is at 30. And just seeking, this is where it says, the plan change seeks to continue these restrictions on tangata whenua input by giving renewal of existing consents to take groundwater for irrigation, for frost protection, etc.
Which number?
This is paragraph 30 on page 11.
Oh,
I was just wondering if you were recommending any particular. So this is on your original, sorry.
oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
We're looking at two different paragraph 30s.
In which part?
Just paragraph 30.
Yep.
I was just wondering, were you making a recommendation in regards to that? So you've set out that's your view of the situation, and whether there was a recommendation that you were suggesting
No, sorry, that submission's on the stakeholder group process. Sorry, I don't. How does it start off, your paragraph 30?
It just says, proposed plan change 9.6 to
Oh, yeah,
continue
yeah,
these
got it.
restrictions.
Yep.
Yep. Just question, was there a specific recommendation to that? Was it?
Yeah, we
in those
were
bullet
looking
points?
at, okay, it's either change the criteria around the rules so that tangata whenua can have input to it, because in its current state, I think the rules say that only discretionary and something else, only discretionary activities enable tangata whenua input. And we were saying, well, hey, this is our taonga as well. So even at that restricted discretionary status, if we are affected parties, we should have the right to have input to it. And I guess it was leveraging off or also referring or in consideration of the model in terms of, hey, we haven't had a great deal to do with the model, which then underpins all of the allocation. So we should have a go at some stage.
Yeah, I think the point was well made, where you may not have had the input into the model, you would have to input into the process and how
That's
it would be
right,
applied.
yeah.
So I think the point was well made, but it didn't have a recommendation. It just pointed out that was a situation you saw. But
Right.
was the recommenda- And I was looking at the bullet points and I couldn't see which one fitted those. But that makes sense.
All right.
Thank you. I'll just check if you've got any other questions. Don't give me an eyebrow, because I think that's yes. I think that's all of our questions. Thank you very much for coming in, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Kia ora. We're going to have a stretch of our legs, and we might even ask the air conditioning to be turned up. It's getting cold in here.
Are we going to have lunch?
Well, we're going to have lunch. Yeah, that's a good
lunchtime,
point. We'll check on whether, are we having lunch?